Hi, I'm going to be reading you a new book. It's called The Diamond in the Window, and it's by Langton. And these chapters aren't as long, so, but I have a picture that's starting the book right there. And this is also one of my favorite books when I was in 4th grade. Well, I'm not sure what grade, but I liked this book when I was little. So let's see. Chapter 1 is called Edward Misbehaves, and we have another picture. Okay. Edward Hall sat under the front porch of the big house on Walden Street in Concord, Massachusetts, and thought about his two ambitions in life. The first was to be the President of the United States. That was not very likely, but at least it was possible. The second was unlikely and impossible altogether because he had been born into the wrong family. Why, oh why, wasn't his name Robert Robinson instead of Edward Hall? Eddie took out of his pocket a collection of bottle caps, matchboxes, and pennies and arranged them on the ground in a decorative pattern. If only fathers and mothers would be more careful when they chose names for children. If only they would pick names that sounded well in backwards English. Edward Hall, for example, was all right in ordinary English, but it was terrible the other way around. Drawer de la didn't sound like anything, but Robert Robinson, there was a name. That was a great name. If you turned it backwards and softened the S's, it was transformed into a name as strange and fantastic as that of an ambassador from some foreign land, Trebor Nazenbor. Edward put his two ambitions in life together and whispered under his breath, "Introducing the President of the United States, Mr. Trebor Nazenbor." How glorious, Edward sighed. His older sister squeezed through the broken place in the lattice and squatted down beside him. Eleanor was taller and thinner than Edward, and she wore glasses because her eyes were weak. Her hair was red like his, and it hung in a long pigtail down the middle of her back. Eleanor was very fond of a boy in her class named Benjamin Parks. She switched her long pigtail over her shoulder and stared earnestly through the broken slats. "Someone's coming," she said, "and do you know who it is? It's Mr. Preek. What do you suppose he wants with Aunt Lily?" Mr. Preek was the president of the bank and a selectman. With him was his secretary, Miss Prawn. These two sterling citizens of Concord had decided to take matters into their own hands. In their opinion, this affair of the Halls had been allowed to slide along in the most shipshod way for far too many years. It was high time some responsible persons did something about it. They meant to, and here they were. Their faces were grim. Mr. Preek wore a large, grim vest. Miss Prawn was swathed about in a grim black cape. Although it was a nice warm day in June, she poked her foot at a stove in place in the porch and pursed her lips. Aunt Lily came to the door. Her face went white when she saw who her visitors were. "Come in," she said. The visitors stayed exactly 10 minutes. When they came out, Eleanor and Edward were still under the porch, listening through the hole in the floor. "As soon as I possibly can," Aunt Lily said. $712 is a great deal of money in back taxes, Miss Hall," said Miss Prawn. "This property would bring a great deal more if you sold it for the price of the land," said Mr. Preek. "But our house is on it," said Aunt Lily. "Tear it down and live somewhere else," said Mr. Preek. "Good day, Miss Hall." Edward and Eleanor listened. They could hear the thump-thump of Mr. Preek's feet going down the steps and the crack-crack of Miss Prawn's. Aunt Lily shut the door so quietly that it made no noise at all. Mr. Preek stopped at the gate and looked back. Miss Prawn looked back too and shook her head. They were talking about the house. Eleanor and Edward, hidden under the porch, listened with all their ears. A monstrosity, of course, Mr. Preek was saying. Those dreadful towers, those turrets. And on such holy ground, said Miss Prawn, the sacred soil of Concord, cradle of American liberty, where the Minutemen fought the first battle of the American Revolution, said Mr. Preek, on the 19th of April in 1775 at the Old North Bridge. As the crow flies, said Miss Prawn, flapping her black cloak and looking like a crow herself, hardly a mile from this spot. And do you realize, Miss Prawn, said Mr. Preek, that this ghastly object is within full view of the home of Ralph Waldo Emerson? He gazed sadly across the field at the stream of tourists going and coming from Emerson's square white house. What must they think, he said. And of course, said Miss Prawn, it's scarcely a quarter of a mile from Orchard House, home of Louisa May Alcott. Don't forget that. How could I, said Mr. Preek. How could I forget the author of Little Women? And let me remind you, too, Mr. Preek, that this house stands on the very street that leads to Walden Pond, Harry Thoreau's Walden Pond. Did I ever tell you, said Miss Prawn, my own dear grandfather put Henry Thoreau in jail? No, said Mr. Preek, you never told me. What a glorious heritage. His brow darkened and he shook his fist at the Hall's big house. This blot, this stain must come down. Those Halls haven't a leg to stand on legally, said Miss Prawn. Mr. Preek looked smugged. No, indeed, he said. Within the year we'll have it for unpaid taxes. And then Eleanor and Edward, listening under the porch, stiffened. Then what? Whispered Eddie fiercely. Mr. Preek was smiling nastily. He made a gesture like someone striking a match. He held out the hand with the invisible match in the direction of the house. Miss Prawn clapped her hands. Out in the street they'll be, the four of them, said Mr. Preek. This was too much for Edward. He shot through the broken lattice and planted himself in front of Mr. Preek and Miss Prawn. Sumpta puff, cried Edward. Mr. Preek was quite stout. No, no, shouted Eleanor, still under the porch on hands and knees. Miss Prawn and Mr. Preek recoiled from the small, dirty Eddie and then brushed past him. Stark raving mad, the lot of them, said Miss Prawn loudly. Everybody knows it. He's not even making any sense. Kits and morb, shouted Edward. Miss Prawn was rather thin. Miss Prawn and Mr. Preek looked a little frightened. They scuttled down the street without looking back. Eleanor was giggling hysterically. Oh, Eddie, she said, you shouldn't have done that. Okay, that's chapter 1.